November 1941. A broke kid named Issur Danielovitch walks into a Broadway casting office. 7 minutes later, he walks out as Kirk Douglas. And everyone in that room knows they just saw a star. The casting director stopped taking notes. The secretary forgot to answer the ringing phone. The assistant literally stood up from his desk. This wasn't an audition, it was a revelation. "I've been doing this 15 years, the casting director said afterward. You see maybe 3 actors in your lifetime with that kind of presence. Douglas had it before he even opened his mouth. That's the thing about Kirk Douglas. From day one, he didn't ask for attention. He commanded it. And once Hollywood gave him that power, he never gave it back. If you want to discover more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age, subscribe now. We're just getting started. The stairs to that 4th-floor office were narrow and steep. Issur had walked 43 blocks to get there, saving the nickel bus fare because he'd need it later, maybe for food, maybe for another audition. His shoes had holes in the soles. The jacket he wore belonged to someone else, borrowed from a friend who'd already given up on acting and taken a job at a warehouse. But none of that mattered when he reached that door. What mattered was what happened when he walked through it. His name was called. He stood up, and something shifted in his body. The hunger, the exhaustion, the anxiety, all of it transformed into something else. Energy, focus, power. Years later, method acting teachers would try to explain this process, would create systems and techniques to help actors access this kind of transformation. But Issur Danielovitch didn't have a system. He just had survival instinct and a belief so absolute it bordered on delusion, that he was going to make it, no matter what. The casting director's name was Richard Aldrich. He'd been in the theater business since the 1920s, had worked on dozens of Broadway productions, had seen thousands of young hopefuls walk through his door. Most of them blurred together after a while. But he'd remember this one for the rest of his life. Name: Issur Danielovitch. Aldrich looked up from his notes. The name didn't sound right for Broadway. Too ethnic, too foreign, too difficult for audiences to remember or pronounce. He made a note on his pad. They'd figure out the name later if the kid had talent. Right now, he just wanted to get through the auditions. It was already 3 in the afternoon, and he had 8 more actors to see. "What are you reading for us today?" Issur told him. A monologue from a recent play. Something dramatic, something that would let him show range. Aldrich had heard it performed 20 times in the last month alone. He settled back in his chair, preparing for another mediocre interpretation of familiar lines. Then Issur started speaking. What happened next is hard to explain to people who weren't there. Acting is subjective. What moves one person leaves another cold. But there are moments, rare, electric moments, when everyone in a room feels the same thing simultaneously. When the air changes, when time seems to slow down, when you know, absolutely know, that you're witnessing something extraordinary. This was one of those moments. Issur didn't perform the monologue. He inhabited it. Every word felt necessary, urgent, inevitable. His voice had a quality that was both rough and refined, like gravel wrapped in silk. His eyes, those eyes that would later mesmerize millions on film, held an intensity that was almost uncomfortable to witness up close. He moved through the space with a physical confidence that seemed impossible for someone wearing borrowed clothes and broken shoes. But it wasn't just technique. Plenty of actors had good technique. What Issur had was something deeper, something that couldn't be taught. He had truth. Every emotion that crossed his face felt real, because it was real. The anger in the monologue was his anger at poverty, at discrimination, at every door that had been slammed in his face. The vulnerability was his actual fear that this audition, like so many before it, would end in rejection. The triumph in the final lines was his genuine belief that he would succeed, that he would become someone, that the name Issur Danielovitch would mean something. Aldrich's pen stopped moving across his notepad. He found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. To his left, his assistant had risen from his chair without realizing it. Behind them, the secretary had abandoned her typewriter mid-sentence, her fingers frozen above the keys. Outside in the waiting room, the other actors had stopped their nervous chatter, sensing something was happening behind that closed door. The monologue lasted 3 minutes. When Issur finished, the silence that followed felt heavy, significant. Aldrich realized he'd been holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. In 15 years of casting, he developed a reliable instinct for talent. He could usually tell within 30 seconds whether an actor had potential. With Issur, he'd known in 5. "Where did you study?" Aldrich asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "American Academy of Dramatic Arts." "Who were your teachers?" Issur listed them. Good teachers, respected names, but that didn't explain this. Plenty of actors studied at good schools with good teachers and never developed this kind of presence. This was something else. This was raw charisma combined with disciplined craft. This was hunger channeled into art. This was dangerous. When Issur finally left the office, Aldrich sat in silence for a full minute. His assistant spoke first. "We have to cast him." "I know. I've never seen anything like that." "Neither have I." But there was a problem. The name. Issur Danielovitch wasn't going to work for Broadway audiences in 1941. It was too ethnic, too foreign, too difficult. If they wanted to cast him, they'd need to change it. This was standard practice at the time. Hollywood and Broadway were both in the business of creating stars, and stars needed names that audiences could remember and pronounce. Names that sounded American. Names that sounded like success. Aldrich called Issur back into the office. The young actor's face was carefully neutral, but his hands betrayed his tension. He was gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "You're very talented," Aldrich said. "Exceptionally talented. But we need to talk about your name." Issur had been expecting this. Every agent and casting director he'd met had mentioned it. Some had been blunt about it. Others had danced around the issue. But they all agreed. Issur Danielovitch wasn't going to make it in American theater or film. Not with that name. "What would you suggest?" Issur asked. Aldrich thought for a moment. He looked at the young man standing before him. The strong jaw, the cleft chin, the intense eyes. He needed a name that matched that face. A name that sounded powerful, memorable, American. "Kirk," he said suddenly. "Kirk Douglas." Issur repeated it slowly. "Kirk Douglas." It felt strange on his tongue. It didn't sound like him. It sounded like someone else entirely. Someone confident and successful and American in a way that Issur Danielovitch, son of Russian immigrants, could never be. But maybe that was the point. Maybe becoming Kirk Douglas meant leaving Issur behind. Maybe it meant transforming himself completely, not just his name, but his identity, his history, everything. "The part is yours," Aldrich said, "if you want it." As Kirk Douglas, there was no hesitation. "I want it." What nobody understood at the time was that the name change wasn't just a professional necessity. It was a psychological rebirth. When Issur Danielovitch walked out of that office as Kirk Douglas, he didn't just adopt a stage name. He created a new person. A person without the limitations and insecurities and painful memories of Issur. A person who could be anything, do anything, become anything. But something else was happening too. Something darker. Kirk was discovering that the intensity that made him brilliant on stage could be a liability in real life. The same focus that allowed him to dominate a scene made him difficult to work with. The same confidence that audiences found mesmerizing made his fellow actors uncomfortable. The same hunger that drove him to excellence made him ruthless about getting what he wanted. His first director noticed it during rehearsals. "Douglas doesn't collaborate," he told a colleague. "He conquers. Every scene is a battle he intends to win." It was true. Kirk approached every role, every rehearsal, every performance as if his survival depended on it. Because in a way it did. He'd spent his entire childhood poor, hungry, watching his mother work herself to exhaustion while his father drank. He'd been mocked for being Jewish, for being poor, for being the son of immigrants. He'd scraped and fought for every opportunity. Now that he finally had a chance, he wasn't going to let anything or anyone take it away. But there was a cost. The transformation from Issur to Kirk was never complete. Deep inside, beneath the confident exterior and the commanding presence, there was still that poor kid with holes in his shoes, terrified that someone would see through the performance and realize he didn't belong. That fear never left him. It drove him to work harder, to be better, to never show weakness. It also made him difficult, controlling, sometimes cruel. Years later, when Kirk Douglas was a Hollywood legend, when he'd starred in Spartacus and Champion and Lust for Life, when he was one of the most famous actors in the world, reporters would ask him about his first audition. About that moment when everything changed. He'd tell them a story. The long walk to save bus fare, the borrowed jacket, the packed waiting room, the 7 minutes that changed his life. But he'd always leave something out. He'd never mention the fear, the desperation, the feeling that if this audition didn't work, if he didn't book this job, he might not survive. That level of vulnerability was something Kirk Douglas could never show, not even decades later when he had nothing left to prove. Here's what Richard Aldrich, the casting director, said in a private interview in 1978, long after Kirk Douglas had become one of Hollywood's biggest stars. "I've cast hundreds of productions, thousands of actors, but I've only seen that kind of presence 3 times in my entire career." Douglas was the first. When he walked into my office in 1941, I saw something that both thrilled and frightened me. He wasn't just talented. He was possessed by ambition, by hunger, by a need to succeed that was almost violent in its intensity. I gave him the part because I had to, because saying no to that kind of talent would have been criminal. But I also knew, even then, that Kirk Douglas was going to be complicated, that the same drive that made him brilliant would make him difficult, that he'd achieve everything he wanted and still never be satisfied. Because men like that aren't performing for the audience. They're performing for that scared kid they used to be, trying to prove that they've finally escaped. He was right. Kirk Douglas spent the next 79 years proving himself. Film after film, role after role. Even after he'd won every award, earned every accolade, made more money than he could ever spend, he kept working, kept pushing, kept trying to fill that hole that had been carved into him by poverty and hunger and the feeling of being less than. That first audition in November 1941 gave Kirk Douglas his career, but also set the template for everything that followed. The intensity, the perfectionism, the need to dominate every scene, every set, every room he entered. It made him a legend. It also made him one of Hollywood's most complicated figures, because becoming Kirk Douglas meant killing Issur Danielovitch. And you can't commit that kind of murder without consequences, even if the victim is yourself. Especially if the victim is yourself. The casting office is gone now. The building was demolished in the 1960s to make room for a parking garage. But if you knew where to look, if you stood on that corner in Manhattan and closed your eyes, you could almost feel it. That moment when a desperate young man climbed 4 flights of stairs and walked through a door that would change his life forever. 7 minutes. That's all it took. 7 minutes to create Kirk Douglas. And 79 years to figure out what that creation actually cost.